Police, FBI or other law officials of Reddit, what's the weirdest unexplainable thing that you've encountered during your time on the force? A former firefighter medic was called to a mobile home by the health department to find next of kin information for two morbidly obese men who had died within days of each other, father-son. I had to wear a hazmat suit to go into the trailer because of the amount of bug infestation. First thing that became clear was that they had been too large to fit down the hall to the restroom. For many years, you could see wear marks on the wall, but the hall had been overgrown by cobwebs. They each had a recliner which had a hole in the seat, which led to a hole in the floor of the trailer, for the purpose of relieving themselves without getting up. During the search, some strange things were found. One bedroom, which hadn't been accessed for many years, contained a meticulously catalogued collection of baseball cards from every player in modern history, and autographed. But here is the real killer. I opened the fridge for whatever reason and I found there had only two things in the house: Diet Coke and sticks of butter. Tons of butter. The trash can was full of nothing but Diet Coke cans and wrappers from sticks of butter. I can only imagine they were eating butter and drinking Diet Coke. No wonder they both died. Whoa, if you're eating nothing but butter, I'm pretty sure switching to Diet Coke isn't going to make much difference. This one time I went out on a call of a suspicious person at a house near where I was at. When I get there, the guy tells me that someone knocked on his door, and when he went to see who it was, there was a woman standing in his driveway with some sort of child-sized doll with horns, and it looked like all bloody and cut up. So he asked the woman, who was looking away from him, what she wanted. She turned around and told him it needs food, then started screaming at the top of her lungs and ran at him. So like a normal human being, he slammed the door in her face and called the cops. I get there and there are well-defined claw marks on his door. There's also a good bit of blood, I supposed from her fingers. So I call it out and start the search on foot. I also had 2 or 3 units driving around the area to see if they can't find this chick. So I'm about a block away and we get another call that the woman is back at the guy's house, but in the backyard. So I run about a block back to the guy's house and bust in his backyard. The lights are out, so I have my flashlight out and I'm looking around. I see the chick huddled in the corner next to a freaking evil looking doll thing, and I ask her if she's okay. She doesn't say anything. About this time, one of my mobile units came back to the house and parked his unit where the headlights were shining on her so we could see how scary this chick looked. She had long nappy black hair, her cloths were rags, she had no shoes, clearly homeless, and she kept whispering things to the doll. So my buddy and I approached and tried talking to her, and she just kept whispering to the doll. Couldn't understand what the heck she was saying, so we decided to drag her butt out of there. The second we put hands on this chick, she went berserk, punching, kicking, slapping, all kinds of crap. So we're fighting with her, trying to get her on the ground, and she's not going down. This chick was strong as heck. Well, in the fight she somehow got away from us and was sitting in a crouched position with her head tilted to the side and making the creepiest growl snarling sound I've ever heard. Then she screams at the top of her lungs and charged at us. So, my buddy straight jabbed her in the face and knocked her clean out. We cuffed her and hauled her off to the hospital where she tested positive for PCP and various opiates. She was charged with battery of a peace officer, resisting arrest, and trespassing. Later she was institutionalized for some sort of mental disorder. Not sure quite what it was. My department didn't have anything more to do with her after her booking into the jail. Don't startle the witch. UK police officer here. Unbroken pint glass up anus. Unbroken. Wide end first. Got waved over by London ambulance service, asking us for help to move this guy onto a stretcher. So we carried him onto a stretcher, onto the ambulance, and went on our way. This is one of those situations where I can't decide if the how outweighs the why or not. My mum's story, not mine. One time when she was in her mid-20s, she was policing in Bristol at night. She and her partner, who she already knew was a T, were driving around on patrol when they drive past some road works, which consisted of a trench in the road so the road maintenance guys could get to the pipe. As they drive past, they see a group of stereotypical thugs also in their mid-20s, drunk and throwing road signs and traffic cones into the trench. So my mum's partner pulls over and say to my mum, "Go over and tell them to stop." There are about 6 or 7 of these guys, so my mum asks if he's going to go with her as he is a larger man in his mid-40s and a heck of a lot more intimidating than a petty woman in her 20s. He replies that it only takes one person to do it and he wants to stay in the warm car. So being fairly new, she wouldn't take that crap now. She does what the more experienced officer says. So she gets out and walks over to the men, offers them a F. She doesn't smoke, but always carried a packet and a lighter for occasions like this, and asks them to stop throwing signs into the trench, cause it's criminal damage. Apparently one of them looked over to the car, saw my mum's partner and says, "Why doesn't he come and talk to us?" To which my mum replied that he didn't want to leave the warm car. Apparently the man then gathered his friends in some sort of huddle for a word, and then they started jumping in the trench and taking out the road signs and traffic cones out and putting them back where they took them. My mum thanked them, to which they replied it was no problem for such a nice lady like her, offered her a can of Stella, to which she declined and told her it was dangerous in Bristol at night and that the dong of partner should have come with her, as anything that could have happened. Bear in mind police in England don't carry guns. They then walked away into the night making the W sign and shouting abuse at the policeman sitting in his car that sent the new young female police officer to deal with a gang of drunken yobs. TL. Doctor, if you don't act like a douche-nozzle, people are more likely to help you out. Not my story, but a good friend of mine was the youngest recruit to pass police training etc. in the area for a long time. At 19, he was fresh onto the service. I went for a pint with him a week later and you could tell he'd seen things, so I asked him what it was like. Within 3 days he'd been called to a house of an elderly man who hadn't been seen in a few days. They found the man hunched over in the cupboard under the stairs with his hoover in his hand. They reckon he bumped his head whilst about to do some housekeeping and died whilst unconscious. The body had been there a few days and stank. The head had also swollen up. As for unexplainable weird crap, he told me about this one where they were called to a domestic. They got to the house and opened the door. Instantly a whole load of sewer rats, not pet rats, flooded out, and there was no one home. The lights were on, the TV was on, quiet, and the loud voices they heard arguing were just gone. The only life there were the rats that ran out of the house. They searched the house, every nook and cranny, and found no one. He and his partner for the evening stayed around a while and waited to see if anyone came home, but after a few hours no one came. The neighbors couldn't even explain it, so they left. A few minutes later they got called to the same address again by a different person stating there's a pretty heated domestic going on. This time they brought the dog squad to find people, but again, the house was deserted. He said the freakiest thing was that the toilet had blatantly just been flushed when they got there as the cistern was filling, and the kettle was now boiling. The dogs found nothing as well. To this day he doesn't know what the frick went on. 2 stories from a friend of mine that's a cop. 1. Dispatch gets a call from an older couple reporting there's a man standing in their backyard. It's later in the evening and obviously the older couple is freaked out a bit. Several officers show up including my friend and split into 2 groups heading around either side of the house. As they emerge in the backyard, guns drawn, they see the suspect and promptly order him to get on the freaking ground, face first, hands behind his head. As they draw closer he's not responding and they realize he hasn't moved at all. Rewind 2 hours. The suspect had robbed a 7-Eleven or something like that down the road and taken off on foot. As he entered the neighborhood he tried to cut through this older couple's backyard. When he went to hop the fence in the back he slipped and impaled himself on a fence post. He couldn't pull himself off it and his own body weight slowly drove him down the post. It had entered at his groin and went straight up his shoulder. He was literally a human scarecrow. 2. I can't remember if it was neighbors or family members, but someone realized an older gentleman wasn't following his normal routine and became a little worried for him. I think they checked his front door, which was locked, looked in the windows, called the phone, no sign of him. So after 3 or 4 days the police are called to check on him. My friend and another officer arrive at his house and as they enter the backyard they discover the worst smell they had ever come upon. What had happened was the man took a dip in his hot tub one night and promptly had a heart attack. His body decayed at a much faster rate in the hot water and turned into human soup. 1. At least the couple didn't have to worry about crows eating their corn. 2. Very gross, but I think that was on a recent episodes of Bones too. Nearly all of my family lives in a city of 500,000 in the Midwest. 7 of my family members are either firemen, EMTs, or police. My dad was once called to an accident before people riding in the bed of trucks was illegal. A family was on their way back from swimming in a local river. Mom and dad in the front of an S10 with 3 kids in the back. The dad swerved to miss some animal and slammed on his brakes. 2 children were thrown on the road and got a ton of skin peeled off. The third was pinned between the truck and a tree. Dad was a fireman without his EMT at the time. He drove one of the fireman car things, so he got there first. He had to stand and watch the kids writhe in agony while waiting for the ambulance. He applied for EMT courses the next week. Fireman car things. Fire engines. Afghanistan 2009. Walking through the village of Kirokala. Early evening. Turned the corner. Man freaking his donkey. Eye contact. Oh god, why? Worst part. He looked away and kept on going. Second worst part. His entire family was in the courtyard behind a wall but no more than 10 feet away. I wasn't trained for that. We can judge the heart of a man by his treatment of animals. Immanuel Kant. He tapped that butt. My grandpa was a big Irish cop who started his career in Minneapolis mid-1950s. He always has the best stories to tell, but the one unexplainable one he tells me is that he got a call during Christmas Eve to a house with 6 bodies in it. Being the first responder guy, he speeds his way there and gets to the house. He walks in, gun drawn, only to find a family that looked like everybody had just had a long night and dozed off until he gets no response trying to wake them. He searches the rest of the house only to find a young teen girl in the bathtub with a single tear run down her cheek. Everybody seemed to have mysteriously died at once without any known cause, and he never found out what it was. He's got tons of stories, but apparently he's still afraid that all of the old gangsters would try to kill him if he made his stories public. I keep on telling him that it was probably carbon monoxide poisoning, but he's old, crazy, and just wants a story like they have in that X-Files show. Already posted, but here's another one. Investigating a murder of a 19-year-old girl when fingerprints come back that the knife that she was killed with had her fingerprints on them and wood residue trapped in them. Basically, I had to tell her parents that she had killed herself by putting a knife in a partially closed door and ran backwards into it to make it look like a murder so she could be buried in a Catholic cemetery. The crook actually dug the poor girl's body up, and the parents had a body in their house for 2 days before they could bury her. My buddy with Cleveland firearms gets regular calls for passed out motorists in the popular bar neighborhoods. 99 times out of 100 it is someone passed out drunk in their car. If the car is in park, but still running, he and his crew like to hop out of their rig and surround the car and start running in place, shaking the car and screaming for the driver to stop the car. They love watching the drunks grab the wheel and practically stand on the brakes. If the driver wakes up and slams on the brakes, they have him get out of the car and find an alternate way home, avoiding a DUI with a funny story. If the person doesn't respond, emergency extrication. My brother is a deputy sheriff. He had a call where a frozen dead raccoon was thrown through a window of a mobile home and smashed a glass top coffee table. I'll try and dig up the pictures. Yes, we live in Florida. Where else would this happen? Louisiana. But the residents would have kept the raccoon for dinner and thanked God for providing for them. I worked for a while as a 911 dispatcher. Lots of suicides. There are 2 that stick out in particular. One lady called in screaming and hysterical. Her 15-year-old son had hung himself in the garage. Now, for purposes of the investigation, you have to advise the witness to her suicide to not move the body. Every death, in my area, at least, is considered a murder until there is evidence to prove otherwise, so messing with the body could confuse the investigation. I had to tell this lady don't cut him down, at which point she told me to go frick myself, completely warranted in my opinion, cut her son down, and held him, sobbing and screaming, until the police showed up. Another time someone called in a suicide, gave me the description and location of the victim. The caller seemed really calm. I remember thinking, for having come upon the corpse of a suicide. After I said, okay, the police are en route. Where are you? I suggest, Mom, you don't stand near the body. No need to see that any more than you already have. She sighed and said, okay, my job here is done. and then I heard a gunshot. I said, "Mom, Mom," but she never answered. I advised the police of what I'd heard and for them to be on guard. The lady called in her own suicide. The location was where she was standing and the description she gave me matched the person on the scene whose phone was found a couple of feet away. My dad's a dog handler in the police, and one New Year's Day they got a call saying a guy's phoned in saying he has a koala in a tree in his back garden. We live in Northern Ireland. Koalas are not indigenous. Anyhow, my dad goes along with the dogs, figuring that the man was still drunk high from a New Year's Eve party. My dad and his work partner arrived at the place and there was this guy who seemed totally sober and normal who led them to the back garden, where there was a big tree in which, sure enough, there's a creature sitting. Somehow they managed to get it in one of the dog cages from the police van. They're kitted out for about 4 dogs, and there were only 2 there at the time, so there were spare cages. Turns out it was actually a red panda who had escaped from the zoo and was just chilling around different gardens in the suburbs. Probably not the weirdest thing he's seen, but definitely the most unexpected. He also had to go out on a search through a forest by a big river in the dark after a guy who may or may not have been in possession of a machete. He said that was one of the scariest things that he had to do, because he had no idea whether he was about to get his head hacked off every time he passed a tree. The guy had already cut his friend's arm off then run away, so he was definitely capable of it. Turns out that he had ditched the machete in a field and then gone into a shop in the city covered in blood, and they called it in. My old man was a cop for 35 years. Over the years, I've heard a lot of funny stories. Not many WTF stories, but I think he preferred to keep it light and fun. A guy was threatening to jump off a tall apartment complex. My father was on the ground, blocking off traffic. Eventually, the guy jumped to his death. Commotion ensued and someone asked over the radio what happened. My father's response was he jumped. And what really sucks is the Russian judge only gave him a 9.5 inches. A lot of people with scanners reported him. Result: verbal tongue lashing. A woman pulled over to the side of the road, where he was working a detail. She asked him how she can get to Harvard. His response: study real hard. He then laughed at his own joke, the norm, and walked away. She reported him. Result: chief told him to cut the crap. He got called to a report of 2 thieves stealing oriental rugs from a condo complex. He spotted 2 dudes running with the rug rolled up and on each of their shoulders. I guess they ended up in a wooded area and he was out of breath. He yelled, "Please just freaking stop. I'm going to have a heart attack." The 2 guys stopped and quickly turned around towards him. He reached for his weapon and, wouldn't you know, it wasn't there. He came up with a handful of air. The 2 guys laughed and just ran off with no pursuit from the Keystone Cop. Result: spent 4 hours searching the woods for his gun. Finally found it suspended on a branch. This was before the days of safety holsters. Guy came into the jail on a DUI. Turned out it was like his 5th, so he wasn't getting out anytime soon. He was okay for a few days and then started getting DTs bad. After a few days of mental health and medical saying keep an eye on him, it's just DTs, he started going really nuts. He only spoke in gibberish and not to real people. He would pee, vomit and crap everywhere, but the toilet. He refused to wear clothes and would masturbate incessantly. Despite our concerns that he may have serious mental issues and repeatedly trying to get him admitted to the state hospital, we kept hearing the same response: keep an eye on him. It's just DTs. He'll get over it. Finally my supervisor had enough and called this guy's lawyer. She came down and we took her to the isolation cell. I opened the window on the door for her and she called out his name. Naked, covered in his own fluids and with a crazed look in his eye, he calmly picked up one of his turds and ate it like a Snickers bar before going back to masturbating. His lawyer gasped in horror, turned to me and my supervisor and said, "I'll go talk to the judge right now." 2 hours later he was on a transport to the state mental hospital. I don't really understand the medical aspect, but apparently he was such an alcoholic that the withdrawal had done serious and permanent brain damage. TLDR. I saw a naked guy eat a turd and then masturbate. Not my story, but got it from my father-in-law from way back. Anyway, here goes. Pretty gross and graphic, so readers' discretion advised. Back in the days, no one paid attention to the fact that having major surgery often makes you have a depression. This is something that is adequately handled these days. A guy at the hospital where he worked had a bilateral, double, lung transplant and was left to recover in his room at the 15th floor. Fast forward to the guy jumping from his window and landing on his feet. The shins dug into the ground like poles, the upper body impaled on them. The transplants exploded out on the ground before him and the head hanging upside down in the collapsed chest. It just looked like someone had arranged him in the most macabre way possible. Horror movies ain't got crap on real life. UK here. Not a policeman, but my brother is, and I heard the story from him, though it was all over the local news as well, just without the gore. He wasn't the attending officer on the case but arrived on the scene as the bodies were being moved. I actually passed the scene on my way to work the day it happened as well, though at that time the wreck was being hauled away. So, just the fine details are third party in effect. It's a rather gruesome story, so read at your own risk. A few years back in our local town, a couple of joyriders had stolen a car. The police gave chase but had to pull back due to the speeds involved. They got clocked at 130 miles per hour through a residential area. The obvious happened, and about 3 miles from where the police fell back, they managed to hit a wall or lamppost or something and kill themselves instantly. Upon arriving at the scene, the attending officer discovered the driver's lower legs and feet had been pushed up due to the impact, and his shin bone had gone through his jaw and up through his skull. Apparently it looked like he had a foot attached to his chin. The passenger, however, looked and touched and seemed to be unconscious, until they tried to move him and discovered most of the bones in his body had been shattered. He sort of folded backwards when the officer tried to pull him out for first aid. He then started to compress, squish and implode into himself in the car seat. If you think that's horrid, you should hear the suicide stories, especially the ones of people hanging themselves then not being discovered for a while. More than once I've heard of someone's head popping off when they try to get the body down. The murder stories, however, I don't even want to think about those. I may not always think the police are right in some of their actions, but I certainly respect the fact that they have to witness and deal with some awful crap. I've seen suicide where they slit their wrists and run around the room to get the heart rate up. So much blood. As I mentioned elsewhere, my dad was a copper in the UK in the 80s. A friend of my dad's, let's call him John, is sent out to investigate some suspicious activity in the Oxford area where he finds a house with a ladder against it, leading up to an ajar bedroom window. Clearly a bit suspicious, but he can't see a van or any activity. He decides he had better investigate further, so he proceeds to climb the ladder, remarking to himself how old and rickety it is. As he reaches the top, he briefly glimpses through the window a bedroom, with a cat sitting on the bed giving him a quizzical look. I say briefly glimpses because a second later there is a loud crack as the rung he is standing on snaps cleanly through the middle. John plummets rapidly, each rung snapping cleanly as he hits them, like something out of a Looney Tunes cartoon. The sides of his hands gather a million splinters as they run down the sides of the ladder. He hits the floor on his back and rolls away groaning, clutching his hands which are now 20% wood. As he is laying there, a car pulls up and a guy comes running over. "What are you doing lying in my garden, mate? Are you alright?" John slowly gets to his feet. "I was checking your house, because there was a ladder going up to a window and someone reported it as suspicious." John groaned. "Oh no mate, that's just so my cat can get in. I haven't got a cat flap, you see," says the guy cheerfully. "Are you not worried about getting burgled?" John whimpered. "Nah," says the guy, "that's why I sawed halfway through each rung." I winced when you said his hands were sliding down gathering splinters. Ouch. Not my story and pretty self-explanatory, but a cop I know. Baltimore City found a guy stopped at a red light unconscious with his foot on the brake pedal and a needle hanging out of his arm at like 4 in the morning. The dude had shot up while driving and nodded out at the light. I had a friend once who was driving down the road after getting hammered at the bars. He was in the inner city and woke up at a green light to someone tapping on his window. It was a homeless man who wanted to make sure he didn't get in trouble with the police. Showed up to an incident of autoerotic asphyxiation gone wrong. The guy was hanging in the bathroom in lingerie and had obviously been there for a few days before we found him. Spread in front of him were dozens of Polaroids of him either eating or playing with his own fesses. Several were of him apparently using his own frozen crap to anally penetrate himself. His entire living room, double wide trailer, was immaculate and stuffed with Disney memorabilia. This mental image will haunt me forever. I was babysitting an arrestee at a hospital once. He was there for a mental evaluation and was well known for his antics. Apparently he had a thing for anally fisting himself and pulling his own guts out, and I remember one of the security guards there who had known him from previous hospital stays telling me, now keep your eyes on him because he'll do it again. And he's fast. Sure enough, about 20 minutes later, the guard was right. He was fast. Up to the elbow too. Oh wow, I wouldn't have thought that possible. However, I didn't think it was possible for a uterus fall out of a woman until my professor told us about that happening. When my uncle was on the SWAT team, he literally scared the crap out of somebody. A drug dealer was taking a shower when they busted into the bathroom, guns drawn, and suddenly, goop on the floor. My old man was an LAPD officer for 26 years, most of it in supervisory roles. Two come to mind. They aren't that crazy or unexplainable, but they're amusing at least. A pursuit is going through his division, the ever infamous Rampart Division. Yes, that one. And on its way out to another. It so happens his officers are the officers tied to the chase. So he heads out in front of the chase to the next division's headquarters. He just happened to be there a couple weeks earlier doing some combat training with officers, so he knew the lay of the land pretty well. It comes across the radio that the pursuit has transferred to an on-foot pursuit. They're listening on their radios out in the parking lot and realize right away, this idiot is lost, and he's hopping fences towards the police station. So my dad moses over to the wall on that side of the lot, and this dude comes right over the wall and lands. To quote the interview he gave to the local paper, "In my arms. Most confused perp ever." This goes back to the King riots, the LA riots as most people know them. My dad and a group of officers are hanging out on the roof of the division building, taking a nap. They weren't allowed to leave LA city limits during the riots because there was a good chance that they'd get killed, so they just slept where they were. It happened the old Rampart station, now decommissioned, but can be seen in some old Dragnet and cops footage, has a multi-level parking structure, and getting to from the roof is as easy as hopping up from the top level of the parking structure. So everyone is asleep except this one joker of an officer. He's pretty senior, a P3 back then if I remember, and he's bored, itchy, and remembers. They have a goddamn tear gas launcher loaded with dummy rubber in one of the trunks. He hatches a terribly wasteful plan. What proceeds to happen is everyone wakes up to a god-awful boom. They lurch, run to the lip of the roof, weapons all up and scanning for what the heck caused this. Meanwhile, Officer Idiot is acting the same, but looking kind of suspicious. So my dad, being the supervisor of the hour, night shift supervisor, wanders away to the parking lot to check the cars. Flipping burning patrol cars has always been an LA pastime. They all look fine at first. Then he notices smoke coming from the trunk of a car. He pops trunk. Wanders back, Officer Idiot. Did you discharge this weapon? Freaking laughter. Dude falls apart. Can't keep his crap together anymore. Okay, that's funny, but you're taking a leave and a retoop on this one. Now, where'd the round go? I know he has some really weirdo stories that I can't remember. I'll have to ping him when the opportunity arrives. That shot an emu statement made me think of something when I was in Iraq. Backstory: there was an abandoned private zoo near our headquarters. Somebody had previously released all the animals. This was over the radio while I was on watch. Blah blah. HQ, this is blah blah. Blah blah. There is a bear approaching my position. HQ. Blah blah. Repeat last statement. Blah blah. More emphatically, there is a bear approaching my position. Load bang heard from a distance. Blah blah. Never mind. The bear's dead. Apparently it was a polar bear that had been released and was wandering around and came upon one of our soldiers as he was on perimeter duty. He let it come within 50 yards or somewhat, and then said frick it, and shot it with his vehicle mounted .50 cal. That was a WTF moment. A polar bear attack in Iraq. 10 years on, so I have a few. Got into a foot pursuit with a wanted gang member. Little guy was pretty fast and beat me into an apartment building. I was close enough to see him run onto the top floor and heard a door slam. Now it was a process of elimination. Came to the 4th apartment on the floor and the kid that answered was a fellow gang member of the runner. He let me poke around but said his female roommate was in the shower after just getting home. Knocked on the door and a voice, clearly not female but in an attempt to sound like it, said I'm busy. It was sing-songy and hilarious. I called a couple of my buddies in to wait her out and eventually the kid owner let us into the bathroom with a key. The runner was standing in a steaming hot shower, fully clothed and still out of breath. Best part, he threw up all over the owner's carpet on the way out. Also, while on patrol late one night, came upon two homeless guys in an alley behind a store. An open crate of eggs lay next to them as the one was smashing the other from behind. In horror I noticed half the eggs were missing. Cheap lube. No one went to jail. I just made sure it was consensual and told them to go somewhere more private. To this day, egg cracker is our code word for guys of that persuasion. Somebody, Urban Dictionary this ASAP, I'm using it. Well, this will probably get buried, but what the heck. One of my teachers is a retired cop and has a bunch of stories. The most WTF one was a call he got for a disturbance in a residential neighborhood. It was reported that someone had been throwing around frozen chickens. He arrives on scene and sure enough, there are frozen chickens all over the lawn and surrounding area. Him and his partner check around the area but the chicken thrower is nowhere to be seen. Once they decide they are not going to find the guy, they start heading back to their cruiser when, whiff, flying frozen chicken barely misses his head. He turns around and that's when he sees the suspect. Standing on the porch of one of the houses is a 300-pound woman, butt naked, holding two frozen chickens. The woman screams incoherently while throwing the remaining birds and eventually runs into the house. My teacher enters through the front door, while his partner goes around back to cut off any exits. He makes his way through the house clearing rooms, but the woman has disappeared. Just as he's passing by the bedroom, he gets tackled out of nowhere. The naked, linebacker-sized woman throws him to the bed and he's trapped beneath her rolls. The woman yells frick Emmy while riding him like a bull. Now my teacher is fearing for his life. Not only is he being crushed by this walrus of a woman, but one of his arms is trapped and she can reach for his firearm at any moment. Just then, his partner enters the room and freezes. He cannot believe what he's seeing. Get her the frick off of Emmy, my teacher screams. Holding back the laughter, his partner grabs the woman and they eventually are able to place her under arrest. TLDR. My retired cop teacher gets humped by an obese, naked, frozen chicken wielding woman and lives to tell the tale. The horse was Snooky and the chickens were pickles. Snooky wanted smoosh smoosh. Before tonight I had always figured that I was one of the few unfortunate souls to have had to witness numerous counts of bestiality through infrared observation. That motherfucking LRAS doesn't leave much to the imagination. Man love Thursdays in Afghanistan. How can like 95% of men in such a conservative culture love little boy butt? Anyone who has been there knows exactly what I am talking about. If you are new to the channel, you can subscribe. I publish new videos every day. Until then, check another video. Bye for now.